A Montana man will likely spend the rest of his life in prison after killing his 4-year-old stepson by drowning him in a scalding hot bath. Prosecutors say the boy, who had autism, was subjected to a disturbing pattern of abuse. Now, a judge has handed down an 80-year sentence for what the officials describe as an evil crime. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kennedi Walker, and I'll walk you through the details. You're watching Law and Crime.
Sir, your sentence is 80 years to the Montana State Prison with none suspended.
A Montana judge sentenced Kristopher Harasymczuk to 80 years in prison after a jury convicted him of killing his 4-year-old autistic stepson, Jaxsynn Gatlin.
And has the jury reached a verdict?
We have.
Thank you. Will you please hand the verdict to the bailiff?
To the charge of count 1, deliberate homicide, forcible felony, guilty.
Prosecutors say Harasymczuk unleashed a disturbing pattern of abuse against the little boy. On the day Jaxsynn died in October of 2021, police say he was drowned in a bathtub filled with scalding hot water. At first, his death was believed to be an accident. His mother, Lana, told officers her son had been left alone in the bathroom and likely tripped.
I've seen a lot in 15 years. And what happened to these kids was evil.
But officers noted something was not adding up. According to court documents, they arrived at the scene. Jaxsynn was completely dry, lying on the floor next to the tub. They said his body still felt unusually warm to touch. An autopsy later confirming Jaxsynn died from hypothermia and the manner of death was homicide. The medical examiner noted Jaxsynn had a body temperature of 102 degrees and bruising across his face and body consistent with abuse. That's when Lana changed her story. She reportedly told police that her husband had been in the bathroom with Jaxsynn just before she found the 4-year-old unresponsive. She also alleged that Harasymczuk frequently beat Jaxsynn along with her 6-year-old son using a metal spatula. Investigators later recovered the spatula, broken and discarded in the trash. Police also spoke with Jaxsynn's biological father, who claimed Harasymczuk disciplined the boys with spanking, wall sits, pushing and kicking them to the ground, even forcing them down into the bathtub. In March, a jury convicted Harasymczuk on charges of homicide and assault. The judge sentenced him to 80 years for deliberate homicide, plus 15 more for assaulting a minor and tampering with evidence, though those sentences will be served concurrently.
This is who we're talking about. This beautiful face, this beautiful boy who's gone.
Family members gave emotional testimony, grieving a child they say was failed by the very people who should have protected him.
I'm requesting that the defendant be held accountable for his actions, with sentencing that reflects the time my family will spend without my son, and which will be forever.
On the same day Harasymczuk was sentenced, prosecutors also indicted Lana. She's facing 3 counts each of criminal child endangerment and tampering with evidence. And here to break down the story with me is victims' rights lawyer John Phillips. John, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. I love being with you guys.
So let's just start from the beginning. An 80-year sentence. From your legal perspective, how usual or unusual is that in a child case like this one?
When you have a death, you've got to have accountability. And so, usually judges do impose whether it's a life sentence by proclamation, meaning you're going to serve day for day, every day you're alive, which comes with some statutes, or the de facto 80 years, you're going to have enough time that you're going to, even at your age, and I don't know quite his age, but 30s to 40s, it's going to be a de facto life sentence. And so when you have a death, it is common,
We know he was also convicted of assault and tampering with evidence. How do prosecutors typically build a case with multiple serious charges like this?
You kind of start top down. Obviously, the prosecutors want the highest charge. The abuse, the neglect, the bathtub incident where this poor 4-year-old died as a result of scalding hot water. And then you kind of work your way backwards. And here the investigation was, revealed the the gentleman, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, but that he had broken and thrown away some of the tools of his abuse, things that he used to hit the kid. And so you kind of tack some of that stuff on to be able to tell a broader story, because you don't want this just to be one incident when it was multiple incidents. And so, you want different parts of the verdict form to have different levels of abuse to tell the full story, that this wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just, a bad day. This was systemic abuse.
I want to thank Odoo for sponsoring this news package. Odoo is a powerful, all-in-one business software that helps you manage everything from sales to accounting and, yes, manufacturing. Schedule your production, manage your assembly line, and fine-tune your work orders with Odoo's all-in-one, easy-to-use platform. Need fully assembled manufacturing software that will put your business ahead of schedule? Odoo has you covered. Plus, Odoo's manufacturing app syncs seamlessly with your sales, inventory, and purchasing models, so everything stays connected and running smoothly. Check out Odoo to take your manufacturing process to the next level and get a free 15-day trial today at odoo.com/lcnewsmanufacturing. And just the charge of, deliberate homicide, can you walk us through what that means legally and how it differs from a manslaughter or murder?
Right. So deliberate, conscious, with intent. Again, you don't have to. This isn't necessarily first degree murder where there was, people think of, somebody making a plan. Okay, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and the death is going to occur. Here, within the confines of intent to abuse, there is transferred intent to cause, death or serious bodily harm. And every reasonable human knows, and every parent or even step parent knows, you check the water, right? If it's too hot for your hand, it's too hot for a child. And really it's way too hot for a child because, I've got a 13, 10, and 7-year-old. I've done this, over and over and over again. They need lukewarm, preferably with some bubbles on top. And that's not this. This was a deliberate intent to abuse. It's just a horrible set of facts, because I can't imagine. You think of cooking on a stove, and how hot that water has to be to put food in. I just can't imagine putting a child, in scalding water.
Right. And according to documents, the boy's body was found dry next to the bathtub, but was still warm to touch. How significant is that detail when it comes to proving intent or foul play?
It is, the fact that the body was, there. And I know that the defense team is kind of pointing fingers at the mom as well. And the fact that mom took the Fifth Amendment, that they didn't get a chance to cross-examine or otherwise bring in evidence of her involvement. But again, you want, a prosecutor's office want things kind of tied together as neatly as possible, even in a horrible set of facts like this. And so, the baby didn't get in and get out by themselves, right? And so clearly, the baby was removed from the tub, which again shows that there was human intervention, and it all pointed to the stepfather.
Right. And I know that prosecutors relied heavily on just medical evidence, the autopsy, any reports from the medical examiner. If you could just explain more about that, about how important is that, especially because that child wasn't able to testify himself and there were no other witnesses other than the mom and the stepfather who have both been charged.
Yeah, an important thing to note here is this is small town justice, right? The interviews post trial are just good old fashioned lawyers, not the kind you normally see all over the news. This isn't Diddy's defense team, right? And the prosecutors put it best that both the defense expert and their expert testified there was abuse, right? They ultimately would disagree on, did this abuse, cause the death, and was this intentional, and all of the things that reasonable experts will disagree on. But both experts pointed to a level of abuse and malfeasance. And in a small town situation, that's going to win you, cases like this more often than not.
Right. And just getting more into the details of just the horrifying alleged abuse that this little boy went through. I mean, the autopsy found bruising and a body temperature of 102 degrees. I know you just mentioned, the example you gave about cooking food on the stove and how hot that water must be in order to boil something. Well, imagine having a body temperature of 102 degrees. How do prosecutors typically use those findings in court to really hone in on that abuse?
Yeah, I didn't watch this trial, and so I don't have the exact answer of what they did. But as a parent, we all know that if our kid has 102-degree fever, right, just a fever, that's important enough. 98.6 is average. You get into triple digits, you start getting the pediatrician on the line. You start considering going to a hospital. And 101, bad. 102, real bad. 103, get it going, And so, here you had to have a baby soaking long enough to change not just, the mouth temperature, but the ambient temperature of this child to raise, to extreme levels. And that just cooks a human inside, and is enough to cause death with pain. This wouldn't have been an easy death. And I'm sure that the experts got into what the temperature of the water had to be to raise the ambient body temperature, but it would be north of 102. And there's in most households, most reasonable households, there's limits on how hot the hot water can get. And so, again, you've just got a series of bad facts. Was this intended as torture? Was this intended to punish? Which was a lot of the testimony that I read about at trial, that there would just be constant hardcore punishments. Keep hot sauce in your mouth. Just punishments of this poor 4-year-old that you wouldn't even put people through on the worst game show in American television.
And if we could just move on to the mother, how much weight does her conflicting story carry legally? We know that Lana changed her story according to police. Will that be used against her?
It will be. Everything that the prosecutors have said, and even the defense team, related to their appeal, is that's the next target. Because again, parents should know, right? And she's changed her stories. There were clear signs of abuse that she had to have known about her and ignored. And I have a feeling she's going to be. I don't have a feeling. They've told us she's going to be the next target of an investigation, and
Yeah, she's already been indicted. Why would prosecutors wait until the day of her husband's sentencing to bring those charges? Do you think that was strategic?
I think it was. You certainly, prosecutors got it in the right order. I'll say that, right? Based upon the facts that they have, the evidence that they have, the law that they have, they got the conviction of the principal. And, certainly the principal deflected to the wife or to the mom, but you wouldn't want them necessarily pointing fingers at each other at trial, because you could find reasonable doubt that exists there. Well, that wasn't the mom, that was the stepdad, and that wasn't the stepdad, that was the mom. And here, you've kind of tied a bow around a very serious conviction for the stepfather, and now the systemic abuse and her role in it is going to be the next level of the story.
Yeah, she's been charged with child endangerment and tampering with evidence. What do those charges actually mean in plain terms?
Tampering with evidence, again, the cover up sometimes is worse than the crime, right? We know with his situation, it was throwing away some of the tools of abuse. Oftentimes you'll see deleted text messages or here there was a lot of reference to some of the living conditions being unreasonable, and there being a lot of cameras inside the house. I don't know exactly what was deleted, what was changed, but prosecutors do, investigators do. And then from the other standpoint of the abuse, you had a child that there was unrelenting evidence that was a victim of abuse and systemic abuse, serial abuse, constant abuse. And so you can't just sit idly by and let a child be injured and here killed, under the guise of discipline, right? Or more stern parenting. This was not that. This was abuse. And so now they're looking to see what, her role was.
Right. And what I've noticed in a lot of these cases when both mom and dad or husband and wife are being charged, there's a lot of finger pointing. No, the mom did it. No, in this case, the stepdad did it. So from a legal standpoint, how do prosecutors determine whether someone is a neglectful parent or an accomplice? Where's that line?
Yeah, it's tough. Every case has its own set of facts, and then you've got both, stepdad and mom that are going to use the Fifth Amendment to the best of their ability. The Bill of Rights guarantees you the right against self-incrimination, and so, but statements do come out. Statements, and evidence isn't covered by the Fifth Amendment. If you've created evidence of crimes, so be it. And so, it pretty clearly the state presented a case that the fatal abuse, the ultimate cause of this poor child's death was at the hands of his stepfather, and that he was the lead disciplinarian. But you got your guy right. Now, what all did mom do to be complicit in that? And I think that's where chapter 2 is going to be written.
And if mom is found complicit, if she hypothetically knew that stepdad was, allegedly abusing the child or doing this, and she didn't call for help or she didn't stop him, I mean, could she even potentially face some type of manslaughter or murder charge?
I think so. I didn't read the indictment, and I'm not as brushed up on Montana law as I probably should be for purposes of today. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at serious felonies. And certainly the investigation could lead to upgraded felonies. Again, I think at least for right now, they're trying to separate the cause of death, here from her role, right? They kind of kept her out of the bathtub incident as much as possible, which is ultimately the fatal cause of death. But the systemic abuse that led up to that is something that certainly can be prosecuted.
Cases like this often raise questions about child protective services. Why do so many child abuse cases fall through the cracks until it's too late? Do we think it's a legal failure or a systemic one?
So child protective services certainly have to get phone calls, right? They have to be, these incidents have to be reported. And with a 4-year-old, they're not necessarily in school enough for a teacher to report it or an independent person to report it. Sometimes you'll see neighbors or churches, sometimes get involved and express concerns. But with that comes liability. You don't want to make a false claim and get sued for defamation or malicious prosecution. And people tend to stay out of it, more now because of social media and how, crazy things get until they know, and then they go into the other extreme. But, it's with a 4-year-old, there's a lot of cracks that a child can kind of slip through. And here again, based upon the pleadings, you've got a couple, stepdad and mom, that were in tandem, that the mom allowed some of this. And, one would hope that if a parent was abusing, a parent or step parent was abusing your child, you would choose your children all day, every day. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And so we see it all the time where neglectful parents will just continue to get away with the behavior. And sometimes it leads to things like this.
Right. And what a sad and horrible case. I'm just interested, in the jury reaction. Clearly, this jury found the stepfather guilty, but can jurors emotionally separate abuse from homicide, or does that overlap usually help prosecutors in cases like this one?
Yeah, I mean, all jury instructions across the country generally talk about the believability of witnesses and the intent to keep sympathy, right? Empathy and compassion out of the objective decision of guilty or not guilty, or, civil judgments, right? And that's the ambition as far as the law. But when you have a, deceased, abused 4-year-old, every parent in that jury box is putting themselves in that position and feeling hard for that child. Lawyers can't golden rule and say, well, how would you feel if this was your child, right? It's just unfair. But you in a case like this, the jury puts themselves in that position, and when you have abuse and the abuse is proven, and you have kind of destruction of evidence of an abuse, the next link in the chain is pretty easily linked, that you have, you now have a death at the hands of somebody that had abuse, and, mercy will rarely be spared.
Kristopher's sentences are being served concurrently. Can you explain what that means and how it differs from consecutive sentencing?
Right. So think of consecutive as stacking. So there was an 80-year sentence for the primary crimes, and then there was, I think, 15 years added on for the evidence and abuse. And if it were consecutive, he would have 105 years. But they run them concurrent so that they kind of stack. They like, if you think of two towers, right? If they're consecutive, one tower stacks on top of the other. Otherwise, they're just next to each other. And so the 15 years and the 80 years run together. So the 15 years is kind of absorbed by the 80 years. But in a case like this, where you subtract, even if you subtract good time, gain time, all of the things, minus 80 years, minus the guy's life expectancy, it should lead to a life in prison.
Any chance he could appeal his conviction or sentence?
Yeah, his defense attorneys have already indicated an intent to appeal, particularly on the inability to cross-examine or address the mother, and some of the rulings related to or the acceptance of rulings related to the Fifth Amendment. So, on any case where there's a life sentence, or tantamount to a life sentence, you're going to see an appeal, and oftentimes, even if you had private counsel for, and I don't know if this was a public defender or private counsel, but even if you had private counsel for the jury trial, right, you can get appointed counsel for government paid counsel for an appeal. So, there's almost no harm in it.
Will that work though? I know you said because the wife, she used her Fifth Amendment right, but if that's her right, how can you appeal that?
Yeah, the Fifth Amendment, courts don't play around with. And so, I guess the argument here was there were some statements that she had released, but yeah, I didn't watch the trial to see, what happened in jury selection and what happened with objections and what happened at closing. But good lawyers keep a notebook throughout trial of any, objection that you lost that you shouldn't have. And, you try to throw it together as best as possible to give yourself, and your client another chance.
All right. Well, we will be following to see if an appeal happens and, of course, following his wife's case as well. John, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
Lana Harasymczuk's bond was set at $100,000. If she is released, she will be required to wear a GPS monitoring device and be prohibited from having any contact with minors. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.